Time for a Man in Gray book review. Today's book is A. Wilson in an Hour by Joan Harrington, published in 2009 by Smith and Krause. It's 90 pages. This book is part of the Playwrights in an Hour series. As the title implies, these are very short books devoted to a specific playwright to kind of introduce them. Each book has the same format. It begins with a timeline of the playwright's life. Then there's a list of the playwright's works. Then there's an essay, which combines a biography with a critical study of their major plays. And then there are scenes from individual plays by that playwright, major plays. There's short scenes from each play, kind of give you a flavor of the author's writing. And then there's an extensive biography. The A. Wilson of the title here is August Wilson, an African-American playwright who was born in Pittsburgh in 1945 and who died in 2005. August Wilson is best known for the Pittsburgh Cycle, or sometimes known as the Century Cycle. This was a series of 10 plays, all but one of which are set in the Hill District neighborhood of Pittsburgh. And each play is set in a different decade of the 20th century. So there's 10 plays, one for each decade of the century. The Hill District in Pittsburgh was and is a black working class neighborhood. And so the plays trace the development of this neighborhood over the course of the 20th century. And there are two kind of contradictory trends occurring as you read through these plays. In the early decades of the 20th century, the Hill District in Pittsburgh in particular was a very prosperous city and neighborhood because you had a big steel industry. It was a major manufacturing hub. And so people were doing well. But at the same time, the African-American population, of course, was segregated and subjected to enormous prejudices and restrictions on where they could live and so forth. And the contradiction is, as time goes on, of course, black people in the Hill District began to become more free. They were allowed to vote. They were allowed to hold jobs they hadn't previously been able to hold and so forth. But at the same time, Pittsburgh and the Hill District went into a decline, right? The steel industry began to fall apart. Manufacturing moved out to overseas. And the Hill District began to deteriorate at the same time that the people living in it had more rights. And so by the 1980s, when you get to the last few plays of Wilson's cycle, the Hill District has become this impoverished area full of crime, terrible schools, a lot of drugs and violence and so forth. And so there's a contradiction in the series of plays as they go through. The author of this book, Joan Harrington, is a major August Wilson scholar, and she was a longtime friend of August Wilson, so she gives a really authoritative essay here on Wilson's work. August Wilson really came from an unlikely background to become the most prominent black playwright in America in the late 20th century. He was born in the Hill District of Pittsburgh. His father was a white German immigrant. Wilson's birth name actually was August Kittle, but after his parents divorced, his father was a white and his mother a black house cleaner. After they divorced, he didn't have anything else to do with his father. His father kind of just abandoned the family. And his mother remarried to a man who had just gotten out of prison after 27 years for committing a murder during a bank robbery. And so August Kittle changed his name to August Wilson, his mother's maiden name. And his stepfather's life story became an important element in some of his plays. The idea of a black man. Basically, what happened is he robbed something to try to get money to go to school, and then he wound up killing somebody during a robbery. He spent much of his adult life in prison. When he got out, he was determined to not repeat the mistakes of his past, and so there's sort of a redemption idea involved there. Wilson was a very smart kid, but he suffered a lot of discrimination in school. His mother insisted on putting him into a Catholic school. because the schools in the Hill District were so terrible. But the Catholic school was almost entirely white. He was one of the very few black students there and was constantly being harassed. And he finally dropped out of school I think, in 11th grade because one of his professors or one of his teachers accused him of plagiarizing a paper that he'd written about Napoleon Bonaparte because he said, well, a black kid couldn't write this well. And so that infuriated Wilson, and he dropped out of school and never went back. But he continued to educate himself. He would go to public libraries and spend hours reading all kinds of books and learning. He joined the military, but he didn't stay very long. And then he came back to the Hill District and spent years kind of doing odd jobs and scraping by to try to survive and writing poetry. But eventually he turned to playwriting. He found that he had a knack for writing dialogue, and he was fascinated by the people that he met in the Hill District and their life stories. His big breakthrough came in 1982. The Eugene O'Neill Theater in Connecticut has a summer playwriting workshop program where they workshop new plays. And he had submitted 2 other plays previously that had been rejected. But in 1982, they accepted his play, Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, which was about blues singer Ma Rainey and her attempt to record a song in Chicago in the 1920s. And so he put on this play, a workshop version of this play, and it was very well received. And the Yale University staged the play, and then it moved to Broadway, and it became a huge hit and became very successful. And then Wilson's next play, Fences, also appeared on Broadway, was a big hit, and won the Pulitzer Prize. He actually won the Pulitzer Prize twice, once for his play Fences and for another play called The Piano Lesson. And it was about this time that he conceived the idea of doing a play, one play for each decade of the 20th century, to trace the history of Pittsburgh and the Hill District. One of the things that, or one of the important things in the essay that Harrington writes in here are the contradictions within Wilson's writing and his personality. He identified himself very strongly as a black playwright. He wasn't really a black nationalist, but he was sympathetic to their ideas, and yet, of course, he was half white. Of his 3 wives, 2 of his 3 wives were white, and when he died suddenly from cancer in 2005, his wife, who was white, got control of his estate. So ironically, this guy who was sort of sympathetic to black nationalists, his entire literary estate is controlled by his white wife. Another contradiction is when Wilson became famous after winning the Pulitzer Prize and having these successful hit plays in the early 1990s, he was very public in advocating that black playwrights should concentrate on black theater, that he wanted plays to be staged by black directors with a black cast and a black-owned theater. He thought it was important for black people to build up their own theatrical community and not to rely on the traditional white theater establishment. And yet Wilson himself didn't do that. All of his major plays were staged by white theaters. All of the major plays appeared on Broadway. They were all staged. They did have black directors and they did have black casts for the most part, but they were all staged by white theater owners, theater companies. And so he didn't follow his own advice that he was giving to people. And so, it's one of the contradictions. He also, one of the themes that Harrington points out here, one of the themes that run through all of his plays is the idea that when African Americans moved out of the South during the Great Migration, during and following World War I, right, the biggest mass migration of Americans in history. When Black Americans or African Americans moved out of the South to the North, they lost connection with their heritage, with their African tribal heritage from pre-slavery times, and they really lost their essence of who they were because they moved to the North, surrounded themselves with white people, and they lost the culture, the African American culture that had built up in the South. And that's one of the themes. Even the characters in his plays that are successful still feel unfulfilled because they're living this isolated world and they're not part of a black community that they would have had if they'd been in the South. And again, this is contradictory because Wilson himself never lived in the South. He grew up in Pittsburgh, and then later he moved to St. Louis, and then he spent the rest of his last few years living in Seattle, a city not particularly known for its African American culture. So there are a lot of contradictions between what Wilson's themes in his plays and his political statements he made and his own personal life. But that doesn't mean that his plays aren't valuable or that he was a colossal hypocrite, because I don't think he was. He honestly believed the things that he set forth. And again, as I said at the beginning of this, each one of these books ends with a selection of scenes from some of the playwright's plays. So if you've never read or seen any of Wilson's plays, that'll probably give you a real taste of his writing style and his great grasp of African American speech and his great ability to grasp dialogue. The scenes in the plays that are featured in this little book include Fences, his Pulitzer Prize-winning play, Joe Turner's Come and Gone, Two Trains Running, King Hedley II, and Gem of the Ocean. So 5 of his plays from the Pittsburgh cycle have short scenes in here, so you can read those and kind of get a sense of what Wilson was writing about. So this is a good introduction to a major American playwright. If you haven't read any of his plays or seen them, Netflix a few years ago signed an agreement with actor and director Denzel Washington to film all 10 of Wilson's Pittsburgh cycle plays. And so eventually you'll be able to watch all of Wilson's major plays on Netflix. They're going to all be filmed. Some of them have already been filmed. The Piano Lesson and Fences have both been filmed. And so you can see some of his plays if you stream it online. And all of his plays are available in book form, so you can read them as well. The book is A. Wilson in an Hour. The author is Joan Harrington. This has been another Man in Gray book review. Thanks for watching.